Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming today. This is really an honor for me to be here at USC at the Korean Studies Institute. Today I wanted to present some key findings from ongoing research looking at how the North Korean regime, how the North Korean elites are getting richer under sanctions. When you look at something like this question here, the big question for a lot of people in the policy community is, so what? So what if some members of this regime in Pyongyang are getting wealthier in the current situation? But I think when we look at this puzzle in more detail, what comes out is this notion that pathways that enable these elites to become wealthier are essentially a dual-use technology. In many respects, if we look at how the elites are making money, how they're able to procure certain things, in one particular transaction that might be something for banned luxury items, but in other instances it could be for components that fall under the category of dual-use technology. So with this, I wanted to first give you a comparative analysis of the policymaking process. Looked and examined very much against this notion of the medical analogies here. So first off, when we look at this whole notion of policy analysis, there's a great deal of diagnosis component that's missing. If we first look at the medical equivalent here, the first step where the medical professionals are looking at a particular issue, a health issue, you're looking at 70% of the time and effort focused on this notion of what's going wrong here. So they're trying to establish causality. In many instances, they're going to run tests. They're going to try to figure out what is causing this particular ailment. After running these type of tests, consulting with their colleagues, in many cases, it'll be generation of maybe one or two main hypotheses. And based on that, this notion of how are we going to treat this particular ailment? And here it's about 20% of the time and effort. And the remainder is looking at the monitoring of the situation. With surgery that goes well, there could be complications related to the mixture of medications that the patient takes afterward. Now, if we were to apply this methodology to something like the policy analysis, or policy formulation, I should say, in more particular, first and foremost, we are not in the diagnosis area. We're actually seeing a situation where time and time again, it's immediate jumping into policy implementation. So this notion of, here's a crisis, how do we deal with the crisis? In many respects, when you look at policymakers and their perspective, it's very important when you look at the dynamics here. A lot of it is related to this crisis. Literally there's a fire. How do we put out the fire? And there's a sense that we don't have time for diagnosis. Diagnosis is a luxury. And so with this, you see the first step being policy implementation, the equivalent of the treatment phase, and we're looking at about 80% of time and effort. It's only when things don't go according to plan, that goals aren't met, the more complications on the horizon, that there's a retroactive diagnosis that's done. And here you're looking at about 15% of time and effort. And again, retroactively is the important word here. Now, with this, the remaining time, you're looking at some aspects of really, in this case, too little, too late, the monitoring of the situation. Now, if you were to take this methodology in the bottom, the policymaker's approach, and again, the caveat is there are very specific parameters related to a crisis situation. So this is something that we see recurring quite often. If we were to apply that methodology to the medical field, and having done this with some doctor friends, and the question posed, if this were a patient and you applied the methodology in the red, what would the health outcome be? And in many cases, the doctors say death. So I think this is one area where you can look at this notion of trying to apply policies vis-a-vis North Korea, and we're seeing chronic policy failures or ineffectiveness. So with this, keep this in mind, because very much this talk focuses on this notion of let's take a step back, and let's try to apply some diagnosis in terms of what's happening here. For us, the puzzle is amid sanctions, the North Korean elite is getting richer. So first off, the first question I'm going to address is why sanctions? The second question we'll be looking at this notion of who are the 1% in North Korea? Who are these elites? And the third question, what's China's role in all of this? Amid sanctions, the North Korean elite's getting wealthier and wealthier. So first off, why sanctions? If you look at the whole list of issues that you can research vis-a-vis North Korea, sanctions are kind of dull for a lot of folks. This is something that looks very mechanical in terms of how North Korea is a target. You look at sanctions, you apply more sanctions on the target, things will get better. And essentially that's a formula. You don't see much deviation from it. But when you peel back the layers in terms of the application of sanctions, there's a lot in terms of causality that comes up. So first off, right now, sanctions in many respects constitutes the antibiotics of American foreign policy. If there's a foreign policy issue on the horizon, or it's something near term or medium term, usually the first recourse is to apply sanctions on the target. If you look at it from the perspective of a proliferation toolkit, sanctions going down the list is at the bottom. First is a consideration of use of force. So this idea of can we apply use of force on this particular foreign policy issue? In many cases, the costs outweigh the benefits, and the idea is that unless there's a direct attack on the American homeland, unlikely that we'll see the application of force. There is neither the political will in the American public nor the resources for a large use of force as we've seen in recent years. The second thing that we've seen is a recent resurgence of diplomacy with the Iran deal. But a lot of the chronic issues, and particularly as we look at North Korea, diplomacy is something in a stalemate situation. We haven't seen much traction in a number of years. Cyber is something that we've seen recently, vis-a-vis Israel and the United States applying cyber on Iran. But cyber is still in its infancy. If you look at the international relations field, cyber is a growth area, but I think gives you a sense of how it's very difficult to replicate certain types of cyber means against particular targets. This leaves us with targeted sanctions, and when we look specifically at North Korea, we've really seen the increasing of the dosage of sanctions. Some would argue that there's more room for applying sanctions, but really what we're looking at is in the areas where North Korea has been the target of sanctions, what has been the cause and effect type of situation. So first off, I think it's important to look at what's driving the increasing application of sanctions. First and foremost, it's almost cost-free in terms of implementation. You don't see a branch of the US government going to Congress and asking for appropriations to apply sanctions. A large part of it is because you're looking at the international financial system, which is essentially an extension of the US financial system. So when the Treasury Department comes out with a statement or some sort of warning not to do business with an entity or an individual, that entity or individual becomes a pariah on the international stage. No one does business with that individual. So very effective from that perspective, but also this notion that, again, low cost of implementation. The second is when you look at the whole debate about sanctions and also the focus on a target and the applications of sanctions, it's a great deal of visibility in terms of what any given US government administration gets, in terms of sending messages to US public as well as international audiences. Then third, you see a lot of coordination. You see a senior US official, usually that person's title is coordinator on sanctions, going and meeting with counterparts in a host of countries, big press conferences and so forth. So as a metric, any given government can point to this notion that sanctions are working and that there's a great deal of positive, effective coordination. But the key thing here is this notion that as much as sanctions are an important element of US foreign policy now, and specifically in dealing with North Korea, we haven't really looked at the secondary and tertiary effects of sanctions. And here I would say that it's in the realm of unintended consequences. And the analogy of antibiotics is an interesting one. If you look at some organisms where there has been this increasing application of antibiotics, the organisms that survive build a certain type of resistance. And in some key areas, North Korean regime has adapted in a similar fashion. There are evasion techniques, there are some interesting partners, there are a number of things that present a picture that would be counterintuitive, but very important in terms of this exercise of trying to figure out this puzzle. And within the broader international relations literature and policy analysis, sanctions still remains under-examined from the perspective of the target. From this kind of scholarship, you see a lot from the sender's perspective. These are national authorities applying sanctions on countries. A great deal of research and a great deal of findings that have been sliced and diced over the years. So to put a lot more specificity in terms of what we're looking at, if we see one aspect of this puzzle, and the puzzle really looks at, again, this notion that if you do view the elites in North Korea becoming wealthier, how is that possible? What is accounting for this increase of wealth? As much as there is procurement of banned luxury items, there are UN Security Council measures in addition to US executive orders. These are measures that come out of the White House. You're looking at instances where, in the particular case of North Korea's ballistic missile capabilities, there's some very troubling patterns here. So if I take you down memory lane here and look at the period of April 2012, the North Korean regime conducted a missile test. And a few seconds into flight, you saw that rocket break apart. And it didn't go anywhere near the planned splashdown areas near the Philippines. This turned out to be a huge benefit in terms of forensics. The South Korean Navy was able to go out and salvage the core elements of the rocket. and they were able to find which elements were indigenously produced or put together. But most importantly, they were able to find more sophisticated electronics and components, guidance and other aspects that would, had this been successful, reach the splash field down towards the Philippines. Amazingly, with these type of components, the dual-use technology, the equipment as well as the technology, a lot of it was made in China, but not only China, made in the UK, made in the United States and other Western European countries. So the question, how did the North Koreans get this? This idea of piecing together these products and trying to find out the logistics chain becomes something that is more procedural in terms of something that becomes a gap and a bridge too far. A few months after the April 2012 test, North Korea put together another long-range ballistic missile test and launched in December 2012. In a matter of a few months, North Korea went from abysmal failure to success. It's so striking. A few seconds into flight, this rocket breaks apart in midair. In the second test, you see success, not only in terms of the 3 stages of the various rocket components, but also the North Koreans succeeding in putting a very small, crude telecommunications satellite into orbit. This shook the North Korea watcher community because many people were seeing a pattern where there would likely be a repeat of the April 2012 test. North Koreans trying, North Koreans failing. But when you, again, think about this notion of what would enable the North Koreans to actually complete this type of test, this is where I think we look more and more at this notion of what's happening in the commercial relationship among the North Korean elites and their partners in various countries, but particularly in this case, China. So if we're going to zoom in on the North Korea piece, what are we talking about here? If we were to think about the 1% in North Korea as it relates to these type of commercial activities, we're really zeroing in on something that I refer to as North Korea Incorporated. North Korea Incorporated is essentially the amalgamation of all these state trading companies that are affiliated to the North Korean Workers' Party, to the military and the cabinet. Now for the North Korean regime, these state trading companies are very important. They serve very specific functions. One is for the elites in terms of their interactions with the regime to have a type of relationship where the regime leadership can try to cultivate and maintain loyalty. There's an awarding process of concessions for things like the mining sector, other very commercially lucrative entities and ventures. But the other part of it is something that might seem a little more mundane, but it's a generation of funds for operating budgets of these particular bureaucracies. Now, North Korea is not a normal country, and that might sound like an understatement, but when you look at it from the perspective of a country that doesn't have a national system of revenue generation through taxes or tariffs. So when you look at the operation of these North Korean state trading companies, the money that they produce, the ability to actually siphon those funds and use those funds for operating budget is a critical element of keeping North Korean regime and North Korea Inc. running. So if you were to use a crude analogy, it would be as if the Pentagon here in the United States was awarded a concession to run these coal mines in West Virginia, would sell the coal to neighboring countries, and that money would go to the Pentagon's operating budget. In some cases, the Pentagon selling weapons, and again, the proceeds from that going to operating budgets. When you see that kind of example, you get a bit better of a picture of what might be happening within the North Korean regime with these state trading companies. But the other part, and this is the dual use capability of this commercial activity, is very targeted procurement of key components that go into North Korea's WMD programs. This leads to the whole question of how do we know this? These are very specific types of practices, very specific types of actors. Right now in South Korea, there are a little over 26,000 North Korean defectors. As a research activity, the 26,000 are still treated as a monolithic group. But when you look through the different layers of the 26,000, you do have a large number from the first generation who left North Korea because of food security issues. But the latter generations, fewer in number, are very interesting. These are the individuals who are former managers in North Korean state trading companies. These were the members of the elite who actually did these type of commercial activities, be it procurement or very specific types of sales of items. This enables us to zero in on a phenomenon that really is something of a law of gravity for all of us, bound to this particular equation in the sense that no one can escape it, and that is profit equals revenue minus costs. If you are the United States government, if you are a Fortune 500 company, the ability to survive is really dependent on one's sustained ability to make profits. It's not a function of taking in a lot of revenue if your costs are larger and resulting in losses. And if that type of situation continues, you're looking at entities that, in the corporate world, entities go bankrupt. In a sovereign type of situation where you're looking at national governments, governments default. And the repercussions of something like this are pretty debilitating. For the case of North Korean regime, you're not going to see a default. If the young leadership of Kim Jong-un is not able to continue to crank out these type of profits, you're going to see a type of wobbling of the regime that I think we would be able to analyze from the sidelines. Something that I don't think would produce the answers right away, but at least a lens through which we could better monitor some of these trends that are evolving. An exercise in trying to be a little more concrete in reading the commercial tea leaves. So looking at the third question here, what's China's role in all of this? The first caveat here is what I mean by China's role is really the amalgamation of all the different groups that relate to North Korea in a substantial kind of way. So first off, I wanted to start off with looking at the China-North Korea trade. This graph shows the trade activities from 1993 to 2011. The red line shows inter-Korean trade. It's been pretty consistent. You see a slight increase when we get to the mid-2000s. But the dramatic one is the blue line, which is the China-North Korea trade. In about the 2008 time period, we see a dramatic spike in the trade activities. This, I think, in many respects is a red flag in terms of meriting further investigation. And when you peel back the layers, one thing that stands out in a very glaring fashion is a landmark political event. So first and foremost here, we're looking at Premier Wen Jiabao's visit in October 2009. And I'll go into a little more detail of why that's significant, beyond just the symbolic aspect of it. There are practical agreements that were signed there that leads to this notion that as a research community, we've been looking very, very closely what's been happening inside of North Korea, or the lack thereof, especially with these economic reform efforts. But we haven't paid enough attention in terms of what the North Korean elites have been doing inside of China. And that's a part of the puzzle that reveals quite a lot in terms of some of the current results. In October of 2009, Premier Wen Jiabao led a delegation of senior party officials to North Korea that was really striking. Within that delegation, you saw the chairman of the National Development Reform Commission, the Commerce Minister, senior party officials from the Chinese Communist Party from the provincial level of these provinces bordering North Korea or close to North Korea, elements of the military and so forth. This type of delegation is exceptionally rare. But what is unique here is how it was presented in the media after the visit. In many respects, it was portrayed as this notion of the two communist parties getting closer together, a resurgence of this alliance that many believed still to exist, but not knowing exactly what the form and function of it was. But when you read the press reports on the Chinese side, you get very clear indications of agreements that were signed during this time period. They were under the headings of economic development, tourism, and education, things that really could not sound more innocuous. But these became the gateways through which a lot of the commercial activities between Chinese actors and North Korean elites started, and particularly as they migrated more and more to the Chinese national economy on the mainland. Here, we're seeing in many respects the culmination of Chinese efforts to rebuild China-North Korea relations that had atrophied for many years following the end of the Cold War, but certainly during that time period in the early 1990s, where we saw the two Koreas admitted to the UN, and a period also where you saw South Korea and China establish some very interesting diplomatic and commercial activities and ties. Against this backdrop, I think it's important to look at what's been happening with other countries as well. So first off, if we were to plot on a matrix here what Chinese activities look like, one is this notion that when it comes to commercial activities, the Chinese Communist Party and the different private actors in China have been very, very active. But this activity has had zero linkage to denuclearization. In this particular party-to-party interaction with the actualization and the realization of these political deals, the monetization of these political deals done predominantly through private Chinese actors on the Chinese side, you see in contrast a very different picture. Russia has also been engaged in commercial activities. It's at a lower level, but they've tried to be very careful in trying to coordinate in terms of obligations and what has been said in the SixParty Talks, a grouping of countries that includes the two Koreas, Russia, China, the United States, and Japan, and trying to effect peaceful denuclearization. The dramatic gap between the United States and China is really the focal point of this particular graph. When we look at it, what comes out initially is a sense that China is coddling North Korea, that China is essentially enabling North Korea to continue with their nuclear proliferation activities while they enjoy the fruits of commercial activities. But I think one way to look at it is that the focus on stability for the Communist Party of China has led to a party-to-party interaction between China and North Korea that has unintentionally relegated SixParty talks as a secondary issue. Now, the caveat here is not to say that the Chinese no longer care about peaceful denuclearization. It's that the fragility of this North Korean regime and the instability of this regime is of a higher priority concern. And one way to address that structurally is try to rebuild the Workers' Party of Korea to create more of these portals for the elites on the North Korean side to sink in roots and stabilize vis-a-vis activities within China. If we zero in on this, one way to think of it is that China Inc. has been engaging North Korea Inc. And what I mean by China Inc., really these are the private Chinese companies that serve the function of middlemen. They do a lot of the procurement and the purchasing on behalf of North Korean clients inside of China. One of the key things about China during the period of essentially the early 1990s to the contemporary period, you're looking at an incredible migration of large foreign companies to China. Not this time around to take advantage of cheap labor. Labor costs have been rising in China, but foreign companies setting up production facilities and production lines inside of China, preparing for this rising middle class inside of China. An important element for any multinational corporation's strategy. But in doing that, we're now seeing these type of companies producing products and equipment at the same level of technology sophistication as they do in their home markets inside of China. So when you look at these commercial activities between North Korean state trading companies, private Chinese middlemen, and the procurement of these type of components, going across to the other side of the border and using these type of provinces portals and also looking at commercial hubs within China introduces an element of accessibility and impact that we really haven't seen before. The other aspect of this, though, is an incredibly vibrant activity related to the coal trade. This is something that in very recent years we've seen North Korean trade with China increase pretty dramatically. In 2007, the portion of North Korea's foreign trade that was related to China was approximately $1.9 billion. That accounted for overall a little over 40% of their overall trade. The most recent statistics from 2014, you're looking at about $6.5 billion of trade that is accrued from activities with China, and that accounts for over 85%. The biggest driver of that dramatic increase is the coal trade. And the significance of that is that, as defectors note, the proceeds of the coal trade are left inside of China. So if you think of it as large funds pooled and left in the mainland and not repatriated in many instances back to North Korea, this provides a lot of opportunities for the North Korean elites to draw on these funds for very specific types of procurement. The implications for sanctions is that this is all taking place inside of China. So unless there's a wire activity that deals with a foreign bank or goes outside of China's jurisdiction, in many cases you're not going to detect this type of activity. So some of the very effective measures that have been particularly useful in dealing with countries like Iran in many respects have been nullified because of the activity that's taking place inside of China. So if we piece together some of the commercial tea leaves, we're looking at a phenomenon now. First and foremost, when we look inside of China, a particular pro for North Korean state trading company and for the elites, increasing piggybacking of the infrastructure inside of China, be it the financial infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure, where the North Korean 1% are able to have almost an immediate impact in terms of what their activities produce. A con for the North Korean state trading companies and for the elites is something that is not directed at them, and that's the anti-corruption drive that's taking place within China right now. Anecdotally, you're hearing about key Chinese patrons from the party side being caught up in this dragnet related to the anti-corruption. So one of the clear challenges for this young leadership under Kim Jong-un is this notion of how they're going to respond and get back on their feet as it relates to some of the setbacks from the anti-corruption drive. Going to the summation here, I wanted to highlight this notion that when we look at this question, this puzzle of how the North Koreans or the elites are able to become richer amid sanctions, wanted to zero in on the commercial portals, the partners, and the practices. So just to recap here, the targeted sanctions, as we've seen applied on North Korean entities operating in other jurisdictions, but increasingly doing their activities in China, we're seeing more opportunities for a private Chinese company, these middlemen, to do more transactions on behalf of these North Korean clients, because they're usually attracted by the higher commission fees. This idea that the greater risk associated in doing business with a North Korean entity is now compensated for by these higher commission fees. The result here is that we're seeing larger Chinese middlemen coming out of the woodwork who are essentially pitching for these deals and doing these transactions on behalf of North Korean state trading companies. One example of how the North Korean state trading companies are learning and adapting in a very effective manner in the Chinese national economy. The second is this highlighting of a very important point that when it comes to the counter-proliferation efforts, one of the key focus areas for these type of sanctions, we're seeing a lot of emphasis on what is the primary impact. Is there a setback for the North Korean regime? And if there is, then it's usually a check of the box and this evaluation that the sanctions are effective, and then increasingly calls for more sanctions. What this presentation is not intending to do is join this debate about whether there is room for more application of sanctions. It's rather taking a step back and trying to look very carefully what the effects have been with respect to the current round of sanctions. When you zero in on this activity and look specifically from the angle of this globalizing Chinese national economy and the growing Chinese commercial activities inside of China, I think you get a sense of how there is a rich range of activities that merit further investigation. And the red flag here that I think should draw more researchers is this notion that these activities introduce the element of lower risk of detection. And then finally, the overarching point in investigating this puzzle is really a call to doing more diagnosis. This idea that in many respects, because these are chronic issues, doing a diagnostic evaluation of these type of situations isn't a function of not having time. In many respects, these type of issues are going to be with us for a while. But it's important to start the diagnostic activities because it provides us an opportunity to look at these trend lines with a level of specificity and also with a level of scrutiny that doesn't exist in other areas. And I would propose that looking at the puzzle here of the North Korean elites getting richer under sanctions is an important beginning point, a very important pathway. Thank you.